Hi, this is our third video in a three-part series talking about situations about how to deal with seller remorse. The first two videos were from the perspective of the listing broker when their client is the one that has remorse. This one is from the perspective of the buyer's broker and the buyer when the seller just announces after the buyer has a contract that the seller isn't going to close. So let me give you an anecdote about this one. I represented the buyer in this situation, and a buyer had a property that was under contract. The contract had no outs for the seller. As the transaction advanced to the closing, settlement statements were prepared, and the settlement statements revealed that the seller's proceeds, the amount of money that the seller was going to take away from the closing, were disappointingly low to the seller. And so the seller announced that the seller was not going to close. The seller announced that the buyer was not going to close. Now, you got to watch to the end of this video because I don't want you to play with fire, but the buyer consults me in this situation. The luxury of this situation is the buyer was not buying the property to be an owner-occupant. The buyer was buying this property as an investor. That allowed the buyer to be more patient in this situation. On the advice of legal counsel, buyer recorded the contract in the clerk and recorder's office, the clerk and recorder's office of which the property was located. Note, on the advice of the buyer's lawyer, not on the advice of the buyer's broker. On the advice of the buyer's attorney, the buyer recorded the contract. The buyer got their earnest money back through inertia. I won't go into the details of that, but the point is the buyer got their earnest money back without having to sign an earnest money release acknowledging that the contract was dead. The buyer got their earnest money back. And then we just waited. Because the buyer had, at least in Colorado, not every place, but 3 years after the seller's breach of this contract to bring a lawsuit for breach of contract. And maybe about 2 years later, the buyer got a call from a title company. And the title company said, hey, we're working on this transaction. It's under contract. And we see you recorded a contract about 2 years ago. And we need to have you release that contract. And that's what we were waiting for. And our response was, we'll be happy to talk about releasing that contract. Please send us the settlement statements from this new transaction where the seller is trying to sell the property. Here's some concepts related to this, and I realize that in not all your situations does the buyer have the luxury of being patient. But one concept is that these are situations in which a little bit of lawyering can do a lot of good for the buyer. There's lots of situations in life where a lot of lawyering does almost no good. But this isn't one of those situations. This is a situation where a little lawyering, by doing things like recording the contract, by doing things like filing a lawsuit and recording a lis pendens against the property, by sending a letter to the seller, essentially educating the seller, you don't get it. You are going to close on the sale of this property to me. It's just a question about whether you're going to do it the hard way or the easy way. We've recorded this stuff against the real estate. You're not going to be able to sell this to anybody else. You're going to have to deal with us eventually. You might as well deal with us now. Might create the leverage for your client to not only buy the property, but also buy the property on the scheduled date. Now, you are licensed as a deal maker. You are not licensed as a gladiator. It is not your job. It is your regulator will not like it if you advise the buyer client to record a contract. Do not do that. But you want to advise your buyers to talk to a lawyer. In our prior video, I said don't refer your client to us. That was in the scenario where your client is the one who wants to bail. We don't want to represent that client who wants to bail because we want to help you put the deal together. This video is on a situation where your client wants this deal to close. We and other lawyers can help your buyer get this transaction to the closing side. All right. Remember, a little bit of lawyering in the situations where the other side is breaching can do a lot of good. That's it. Remember the theme. We live in a complicated world. Be careful out there.